if grand juries were so great, then what happened? Why did we get rid of them? How did that happen? And really, the answer is pretty obvious. It's because, well, people in government wanted to do things to you that they would not have been able to do if the people had actually still retained their own independent investigative and prosecutorial abilities. And so you see how the grand jury was actually that was one of the first things that had to go. If you're somebody in government who wants to collude and conspire and share power with others without checks and balances, you've got to go and bind and gag the grand jury. And so, in order to make that happen, there were quite a number of things that went down. Not least of which would just be, the usual weaponization of the press to try to get the people to believe that grand juries were antiquated and slow and inefficient and all that nonsense. And this was one of the arguments actually that you can see in the history of the state of Utah as to why they were disbanded. The state of Utah had actually been forced essentially into an economic recession at the time that it was granted statehood. So the territory of Utah, they were in recession, and finances were tight, and also the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was formally dissolved by an act of Congress at the time of the Constitutional Convention. But I digress. That's a First Amendment issue, and it does affect this one, and for obvious reasons. You'll see why. But with respect to the grand jury, they wanted it dismantled. They wanted to be able to. This was actually advertised as a cost savings by the delegates to the Constitutional Convention because there was a lot of pressure from the people who had, in Congress who had given this enabling act to say, oh, you got to do it, and you got to do it on this budget. And so they actually slashed both the grand jury and trial juries. They limited the sizes of trial juries, and then they bragged that last remnants of the old republic have been swept away. Almost that, right? They said that we've made the grand jury practically irrelevant. Like it's almost not a thing anymore. And in the state of Utah right now, the grand jury only meets once every 3 years. It still exists, and it's gatekept by a panel of judges, and you have to go through all this boilerplate, fill out these forms, and you have to get the approval of a prosecutor before you can do stuff. But you have to appear before a panel of judges and before they will even allow the grand jury to hear it. And so they're super paranoid. These are indications of a government that is extremely paranoid, is that they have the grand jury under lock and key, and they have all these safeguards and checks and balances for themselves, not against their power. They've got checks and balances installed on we the people. So, criminal justice, getting justice when you have an accusation, when you have information, is much, much harder than it's ever been before because they got rid of the grand jury. And they only prosecute by information anymore for the vast majority of things here in Utah. And so, yeah, just making it less available, gatekeeping it, these are very common strategies. If you just go and read the law in your state for how do I complain to a grand jury, how do I get a grand jury to convene, go look it up. Go look it up. That's very important because if we're going to keep our government in check, the people need to be extremely well versed in how to do this. We need to be very confident. We need to know our rights and the constitutional procedures behind it.